We will be continuing in the Doctrine and Covenants in just a few minutes, but our last reading, section 100, was October 12th of 1833. Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon are on a missionary journey up into Canada, traveling through Pennsylvania, then New York, up into Canada. They have a lot of success. I think this is the first mission to actually leave the United States. They get back to Kirtland in early November. While they are on this journey, though, this is when the real atrocities of the Jackson County, Missouri occur. November of 1833 is when they really get going. So, in July, June and July, there was a lot of persecutions, and they destroyed the printing press, Tar and Feather, Bishop Partridge, and a couple others. And on July 23rd, they forced the Saints into signing a treaty in which the Saints agreed to leave Jackson County by the following spring. The Saints then, when Orson Hyde and John Gould are dispatched to Missouri after Oliver Cowdery brought news back, they petitioned the governor. Now, I mentioned most of this in my previous reading, but after that, the governor's answer is basically, I can't do anything until you've gone to the courts. So get out your warrant, sign warrants out for the arrest of the mob, see what the courts can do, and if the courts can't do anything, then I can intervene. So the Saints say, okay, well, we have some hope of protection here, so they go to the courts. They're going to get subpoenas issued for the mob and bring them to court. While they're there are 4 lawyers visiting from Clay County doing business at the court, and the Saints ask them for some legal advice. Not to represent them in court, but just to advise them on how to proceed. These 4 lawyers consult and send them a letter to Bishop Partridge, in which they basically say, yeah, we'd kind of like to represent you, but we can't even give you advice unless you will pay us for it, because we've been threatened and it's just going to be too hard on our business to represent you. So you got to pay us $1,000. That would be the equivalent of about $38,000 in 2025. And this isn't to represent them in the case as if they go to trial. This is just for legal advice on how to proceed. And they say, yeah, I know it's exorbitant, but we need it because if we help you, then there's a good chance we won't be able to practice law in this area anymore. So you're going to have to pay us for that risk. Kind of understandable. But they then state, if you're willing to pay this, send us the money. If you're not, let us know, because even though we want to represent you, if you don't hire us, then the mob can hire us, and we'd still like to be able to represent them if you don't want to hire us. So the lawyers were basically saying, yes, you're justified, you've got the case, but we just want a job. And if you don't want to hire us, then we'll work against you. It's ridiculous. But the Saints agreed, and they sent the money. As soon as it was known that they had hired these 4 men to advise them in the legal matters, the mobs ramped up in their attacks on the Saints. They sent in organized groups to attack the outer villages. There were many settlements around Independence. There was 10 different branches. Only one of them was in Independence itself. The others were in other settlements, and they just start sweeping through the area, attacking everybody. Now, the Saints, when they can, they fight back. There was at one point 2 guys came to kind of spy out one town. They're caught. They attack Parley P. Pratt and are arrested, but they are released the next day without charge. And that was the Saints. The Saints just, they were arrested in the town, and the town said, okay, we're not going to press charges and let them go. However, the Whitney and Gilbert store, or Gilbert and Whitney store, run by Sidney Gilbert, was attacked, ransacked, and all the goods, all the merchandise was just scattered in the street. Now, when that happened, one man was caught, and he was arrested by the Saints and taken before the court the next day, because this happened at night. And the next day, he was simply released by the court. No charges, all charges dropped. He was just released. 2 days later, he had the Saints, the leaders of the church, arrested for false imprisonment. And they were put in jail for several days without really being tried. And that was actually on the advice of a court clerk, because the mob was surrounding the courthouse. And he said, look, if you don't want to die, just let us put you in jail. And so they were put in jail for a couple of days, but the charges were eventually dropped. I mean, they did hold court for a day or two, kind of, definitely a sham court, but the court itself just didn't continue and released them. But the persecution kept going, the mobs kept going through, and eventually the lieutenant governor, Governor Lilburn Boggs, very evil man, he organizes the mob into a militia. He gives them the credibility of a state militia led by a Colonel Pitcher and a Colonel Lucas. All three of these men, Boggs, Lucas, and Pitcher, were all very evil. Apparently, Lucas and Pitcher had signed the mob's secret constitution back in July, and it is later revealed, not at this time, but later it is revealed that Lilburn Boggs was orchestrating everything from the beginning. Now, they come in and they say, well, we've got to arrest a couple of the leaders, 4 or 5 leaders, on a murder charge, and everybody else has to surrender their guns. Now, this is a duly appointed militia of the state, carrying the authority of the lieutenant governor. At this time, the Saints had no reason to suspect Lilburn Boggs as being the evil man that he was. And so, thinking they had the protection of the governorship, they surrendered their guns. As soon as they did, the mobs were let loose, and in 2 days, I think it was, all the Saints at gunpoint are driven out. They said a group of over 100 women and children were wandering the prairies for several days, trying to find their way to safety, and they only had a half a dozen men with them to protect them from the elements and from the wilderness. Eventually, the Saints are all driven to the Missouri River, where the ferry there helps them. Now, some of them are able to bring some of their possessions with them and some food, some provisions, but a lot of them do not have anything with them. They were not able to bring anything. And many families are actually separated, and they don't know where each other are. They don't know where their children are. Children don't know where their parents are. It's all a mess. And they're driven across the Missouri. This is in early to mid-November. Might even be somewhat in late November. And some of them have to cross on the road. They can't wait for the ferry, but most of them go to Clay County. Some of them go to Van Buren County. Now, Van Buren County at the time had 40 or 50 families living in it, but they were of the same spirit as Jackson County. So the 100 or so Saints that moved into Van Buren County were, again, driven by mobs in Van Buren County into Clay. The total estimate here is about 1,200 Saints are driven from their homes and retreat to Clay County. 203 houses are destroyed either by fire or demolition, and the total cost, the total damage of either destruction of property or theft of property, talking not just the houses, but the burning of crops, the killing of livestock, all this stuff, 1,200 Saints. It is estimated that the loss was valued at approximately $175,000 of damages. In today's money, that would be a little over $6 million of damages. Now, I don't think anybody has been killed at this point, but I do know, if I remember correctly, there are a couple of people who die of exposure shortly after getting into Clay County, because this is coming into a hard winter in late November. And there are a couple of the elders, I think there's one man who's like in his 80s, and he dies of exposure shortly after getting to Clay County. But this is the great persecutions of Jackson County. Now, it gets worse for the Saints later on. They have a couple of years of peace. I think it's in 37 that things really get really bad, and then, of course, we eventually have the extermination order. But that all happens after Lilburn Boggs becomes governor and not just lieutenant governor. These are the great persecutions, the mob violence. I don't think the mob killed anybody, but as a result of this, a number of people do die. That is what is going on in October and November of 1833. So let us continue our reading.